Now that we've identified constituents, we can start building phrases. And this is the general structure of what a phrase is. There's a lot of information here, but we'll go through it step by step. So we already mentioned that a head X is going to build into a phrase of the same type, an XP. So this is a noun head, we're going to get a noun phrase. Now, there are some ways that we can incorporate other words into a phrase. For instance, we have specifiers. These specify a little bit more information about the head. We have complements. These are phrases that are selected by the head in order to complete the phrase. If you think of a preposition like into needs something after it. So that noun phrase that comes after it would be considered a complement. We can also insert modifiers in our sentence as well, usually either directly to the left of the head or after the complement. So in general, we can model grammar using phrase structure rules. What this means is that we'll take some sort of phrase to the left of it. So this is the bigger phrase, for example, an NP, and it says that it branches out into two things, an optional determiner and a noun. Now, how this looks in the diagram is the NP is on top, and then it splits from left to right into those categories. So in the case of the child, child is a noun. It's a lexical word, so it needs to build into its own phrase type, and then we have a determiner being the specifier of the noun phrase. In terms of adverb phrases, we can add qualifiers before them. So very quickly, we can say that an adverb phrase is built from an optional qualifier plus an adverb. In terms of prepositional phrases, we can add an optional qualifier as a specifier. We have the preposition head building into the prepositional phrase, and it takes a noun phrase complement, which can then be broken down into more components. So we'll learn what these categories like qual and d are, and we'll learn how to build our structure step by step without needing these pesky phrase structure rules. It's usually better to just understand how words come together rather than memorizing a bunch of different phrase structure rules. So we'll start with adjective phrases. And basically, every single adjective is going to build into an adjective phrase. Now, we can modify them with qualifiers as specifiers. So qualifiers would be words like very, ridiculously, quite, kind of, a little. These are words that specify how adjective or how adverb something has happened. So how red is it? How new is it? How bright is it? When we replace a word like, oh, very, or it's quite new, or it's a little red, these answer how. So these are qualifiers for adjective phrases. Noun phrases are built from noun heads, so every noun will build into a noun phrase, and they can take determiners as specifiers. So determiners are your basic articles like the, and an. It could include possessive determiners like his, or even some quantifiers like few, many, some, each, all, most, and every. We'll also see demonstratives under here, so words like this, that, those, and these. Demonstratives are sometimes treated a little bit differently in languages than just straight up determiners, so that might be important to know, but in most intro linguistics courses, you're not going to get into that much detail. So in the case of some cat and most writers, cat is the head of the noun phrase, and it takes a determiner as a specifier. And in most writers, writers is the head of the noun phrase, and it takes the determiner most as a specifier. Now, we can also modify noun phrases with adjective phrases, or even prepositional phrases and adverb phrases in the future, but we'll just take a look at adjective phrase modification. So in the case of rough edges, we see two things. We see an adjective and we see a noun. This means we're going to need to build a noun phrase and an adjective phrase. The only question is which order do they attach in? Well, when an adjective phrase is describing a noun, it is going to be a sister to it in the tree. In other words, it's going to connect under the noun phrase because the adjective phrase is modifying the noun phrase. In the case of the latest release, we see something with a determiner as well. So the specifier in English is always on the leftmost part of a particular phrase. The noun is release, which is building into a noun phrase and takes that determiner specifier. But we can also modify release by saying latest. So this adjective phrase is next to the noun, which means it is going to be describing it. There's nothing wrong with having multiple adjective phrases in a noun phrase as well. So in some grumpy old man, we see grumpy as an adjective phrase, we see old as an adjective phrase, and both of these are describing man, so they're going to be beside the noun, or you could also think of it as directly underneath the noun phrase because the adjective phrase is modifying the noun. There are some special cases where noun phrases don't have an N head. They have pronouns instead. Some books will write them as pro, and others will write them as N with a subscript pro. You can take whichever approach you like. If the N with a subscript pro helps emphasize the fact that you have a noun phrase, great, but it's not necessary. So pronouns fill in entire noun phrases. If you have a pronoun, it builds into a noun phrase, and that's the only thing that is in the noun phrase. So pronouns like I, you, he, she, they, those are your typical ones, but we can also have pronoun demonstratives like this and that, like I want this or I want that, and our WH words like what, who, where, when, and why are also considered pronouns. Now, after talking about noun phrases, it makes sense to talk about prepositional phrases. So prepositions like onto and with and by are going to build into prepositional phrases, like onto the bed with Jerry. And we see in each case that it takes a noun phrase complement. So in other words, the preposition requires a noun phrase after it in order to be grammatical. So the noun phrase is its complement. And from there, we can break down our noun phrases into smaller categories or phrases, just like we did before. So buy the expensive bed. If we just take a look inside this noun phrase, you know how to do it already. So it's just a preposition introducing a noun phrase, and we can build these piece by piece. Now, there are some cases where you can modify, or I should say specify, prepositional phrases with qualifiers. So onto the bed or by the expensive bed, we can say straight onto the bed or right by the expensive bed. It's a little bit weird to say that these answer how something is being done or how onto something is. You can think of it as like a proximity or directional kind of thing. If it's straight onto the bed, that means that it happened like immediately. If you say right by the expensive bed, this is kind of like a what's the word for it? Kind of like a proximity thing going on. This doesn't happen too often in English, but this is an option, and this is the only type of specifier or modifier that a prepositional phrase can take. So let's do some practice with 3 phrases: the cold iceberg, right into it, and his icy, very sweet, frothy latte. So with 1, the cold iceberg, this is going to be a noun phrase, and I see 3 words under it. I see the, which is a determiner. I see the adjective cold, so it's going to be an adjective phrase that then breaks down into an adjective, which is cold. And then the head of this noun phrase is iceberg. So this is N, and this is iceberg. So I took a top-down approach for this, where I started with the phrase that I knew, but we can do a bottom-up approach as well. So if we think about right into it, well, we can do a tree in this fashion. So we can start with all of our words at the bottom, and we can label them one by one. So into is a preposition, it is a pronoun, and right is a qualifier in this case, as a specifier to the prepositional phrase. So the pronoun needs to build into a noun phrase. The preposition needs to build into a prepositional phrase. And how we can connect these is by saying, well, into is introducing it. So the noun phrase it is a complement, and it takes a qualifier. So because the qualifier is specifying information about the preposition, it's going to be a sister to it in the tree, or you can think of it as being directly underneath the prepositional phrase. So that's our second structure. Now let's think about his icy, very sweet, frothy latte. And let's do the bottom-up approach again. So his icy, very sweet, frothy latte. Now we do not need to put commas when we do our syntactic trees, so we just omit them. So his will be a determiner because it's introducing some noun after it. It's the specifier of the noun phrase for his latte. Icy is an adjective. very sweet. This is a combination of qualifier and adjective. Frothy is another adjective describing latte, and latte is the head noun. So this is going to be a noun phrase because we could just basically replace the whole thing with it. It's going to take a determiner as its specifier, and now we need to connect all of these adjectives. But we need to remember that all adjectives need to build up into adjective phrases. So we can do that. And when we think about the qualifier is modifying an adjective. It's modifying the adjective to the right. So that adjective phrase sweet is going to include very. And now we can attach all of our adjective phrases underneath the noun phrase head for the final structure for his icy, very sweet, frothy latte. Now let's talk about adverb phrases and verb phrases. So adverb phrases are just like adjective phrases. They're an adverb head, they build into an adverb phrase, and they can take qualifiers as specifiers. So again, just ask like, how quietly did something happen? How abruptly did something happen? How easily was it done? Okay, very quietly, so abruptly, too easily. So they do the same things as they do in adjective phrases in terms of these qualifiers. Now, to talk about verb phrases, we need to talk a little bit about transitivity because different verbs have different requirements for what they want on subjects, objects, and indirect objects. So when you have an intransitive verb, this means that you can include just a subject. So if we say someone sleeps, we can't say someone sleeps something else. It's not transitive in this case. It just has a subject. So this is an intransitive verb, sleeps. Eats can be the same thing. We can have an intransitive verb eats for like I eat or Trevor eats. When we have transitive verbs, these take subjects and direct objects, and some verbs can be both transitive and intransitive. So two examples here would be X hit Y, where X is the subject and Y is the direct object. So X is the hitter and Y is the thing being hit. And we could say like Trevor hits, although to me it's a little weird, so maybe not. In the case of X smokes Y, though, in this transitive verb, someone smokes something. So, I don't know, Ben smokes cigarettes, for example. But this is a case where we could have an intransitive version as well for this verb, because it's perfectly fine to say someone smokes, like X smokes. It's a habit, it's a general thing that goes on. So that's a case where smokes would be intransitive compared to the transitive use X smokes Y. So same with eats, we can have the transitive version of that too, where it could be like she eats hamburgers. So you could say X eats Y, where there's an eater and the thing being eaten. So we shouldn't think of verbs as being specifically intransitive or transitive all the time. We should always consider the context. Now, ditransitive verbs have a subject, a direct object, and an indirect object. And there's two forms that we can pronounce our transitive verbs in, or ditransitive verbs. We can either say X gave Y to Z, or we can say X gave Z Y. So I gave a book to Mary, or I gave Mary a book. The direct object in this case is the thing being given. So let's call this the give. Let's just call this the given in this case. And Z, the indirect object, is the recipient of the thing being given. So the recipient is our indirect object, and the direct object is the thing being given. So if we say I gave Mary a book, in the case of X gave Z Y, Mary is the recipient, and then the book is the thing being given. So we do see the different order of indirect and direct object in our two different forms. So when we build verb phrases, the type of verb is going to determine what it looks like. So in an intransitive verb, it's just a verb that builds into a verb phrase. We can add modifiers after, but this is the basic structure for these. In the case of transitive verbs, the verb builds into a verb phrase, but it also requires one noun phrase complement, which is its direct object, also known as DO. For ditransitive verbs, same thing, the verb builds into a verb phrase. That's not going to change, but it requires two complements. For gives Kathy a book, it would require an indirect object as well as a direct object. So both of these are going to be complements of the verb, so they'll be sisters in the tree structure relations. Now, verb phrases can be modified by a lot of things: adverb phrases, prepositional phrases, noun phrases of time. So if we think about something like quickly left, well, we have our verb left that builds into a verb phrase, and the adverb phrase is modifying the verb. So it's going to be below the VP. If we say we walked at night, same idea, the verb builds into a verb phrase, and it takes a prepositional phrase modifier, so that'll be below the VP. If you have a transitive verb, you can still add modifiers to it. So saw the movie, this is going to be a verb phrase. The noun phrase is the direct object, it's a complement, but then we also can attach a modifier noun phrase like last week, where last is a determiner and week is a noun. So let's see if we can draw structures for these phrases. Ate faster, smoothly walked into the cafeteria, and sent my friend a secret letter. So for ate faster, this is going to be a verb phrase with the head ate. And what is modifying the verb ate? Well, it's the adverb faster. So this is going to be an adverb phrase modifier because adverbs are a lexical category, so they need to build into a phrase. And then that is the adverb faster. So that's how we can do ate faster. Let's do bottom up for smoothly walked into the cafeteria. So smoothly walked into, and I want to shorten cafeteria to cafe. Not quite the same thing, but we understand what it means. So in terms of labeling, smoothly is an adverb. It's describing how the walking happened. Walked is the verb. Into is a preposition introducing a noun phrase consisting of a determiner and noun for the cafeteria. So this is going to be a verb phrase. The adverb needs to build up into an adverb phrase, and it's modifying the verb, so it's going to be under the VP. The cafe, well, the cafe is going to form a noun phrase with the determiner. The preposition into will form a prepositional phrase and take the noun phrase as its complement, and then into the cafeteria is describing how or where the walking happened, so that's going to be underneath the verb phrase as well. So that's how we can draw a little tree structure for smoothly walked into the cafeteria. Now for sent my friend a secret letter, we'll do this one top down, something a little bit different. This is a predicate, so we're going to have a verb phrase. The head verb is going to be sent, and then we're sending something to someone. So my friend is going to be one of the complements. This is the indirect object, consisting of the determiner my and the noun friend. And what are we sending to them? We're sending another noun phrase, which is a secret letter. So that's a noun phrase consisting of the determiner a. We have an adjective phrase that's going to build down into adjective secret. And then we're going to also introduce the noun letter as the head of that noun phrase. So this is how a ditransitive verb would look like if we're drawing the tree structure from the top down. So we're now going to introduce some other categories. For instance, conjunctions. We talked a little bit about conjunctions in the coordination test, but what conjunctions do is they take two phrases of the same type, for example, the tortoise and the hare. So two NPs, and it combines them with a conjunction to form a bigger noun phrase. So in other words, it takes an XP, it takes another XP of the same type, we put and in between or any other conjunction, and then we get that bigger version of that phrase that includes both of those conjuncts. So another example would be at night or in the morning. At night is a prepositional phrase. In the morning is a prepositional phrase. So we can join them together with a conjunction to get a bigger prepositional phrase. Now the conjunctions that we have are also known as the fanboys acronym. So for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. It's not a bad idea to memorize these. There are other types of conjunctions that are similar as well. So words like although, for example, which has a meaning that is very similar to and. Now, we have noun phrases, verb phrases, and all the little phrases that modify these things. So how do we build these together into a sentence? Well, when we described things earlier, we basically just said an S sentence is a combination of a subject and predicate. But we want to include tense as well, because verbs can be present tense or past tense. So we introduce this thing called a tense phrase. The tense phrase has tense as its head. It'll be either plus or minus past or contain something else, which we'll talk about later. And it takes a noun phrase subject as its specifier, and it takes a verb phrase predicate as its complement. Note that we're going to revise the verb phrase notion a little bit, as well as the NP notion a little bit, but in general, you can think about them as being subject specifiers and predicate complements. So if we have sentences like your mother cooks really well and your mother cooked really well, we can take a look at these piece by piece. So on the left one, your mother is just a noun phrase. I mean, your mother is much more than that. I'm sure she's a lovely woman, but in this case, she's just a noun phrase. So that's our subject. And we have a verb phrase cooks really well. So we can draw the structure for that. We have our subject and predicate. So we're going to join them together with a tense head. And because we have cooks, this is not a past tense form. We write minus past under T. So that will build into a tense phrase that collects the subject and predicate as its daughters. Now, in the case of your mother cooked really well, we have the exact same structure. The only difference is cooked is in past tense. So now we have a plus past feature under T. But if you can draw individual phrases for noun phrases and verb phrases, as well as adverb phrases and everything else, then you can easily form them together into a sentence by using T and joining them up with the TP. So let's see if we can draw syntactic trees for these sentences. No visitor left in safe hands, and my cute puppy is very happy. So I'm going to do the first one bottom up. So we'll do no visitor left in safe hands. And then we'll build our structure up. For the second one, we'll do top down. So the thing with doing things bottom up is we need to leave room for tense. So usually we'll put tense right before the predicate. So this is no visitor left in safe hands. Left is past tense, so we'll write this as plus past. Now, when we label our categories, for no visitor, we're going to have determiner and noun. Past is going to be a tense. Left is a verb. In is a preposition. And safe hands is our noun phrase consisting of the adjective safe and the noun hands. So I'm going to build from right to left. The adjective needs to build into an adjective phrase, and that's going to modify the noun hands. So safe hands will be a noun phrase. The preposition is introducing a noun phrase as its complement. So the preposition builds into a PP with the NP on its right. And left is introducing that prepositional phrase as a modifier. So that will build into a verb phrase, left in safe hands. Now, when we include tense, we're going to do this last. First, we'll do no visitor. So visitor is a noun. It needs to build into a noun phrase, and it takes the determiner as its specifier. So now to connect each of these, subject and predicate, we're going to take the subject as the specifier, the verb phrase as the complement, and then tense as its head. So this is a tree structure for no visitor left in safe hands. So we'll put this up in the top right, and now we'll do this next one from the top down. So what I know from the top down is that I'm going to have a tense phrase for my cute puppy is very happy. My cute puppy will be a noun phrase subject. We're going to have tense, which is, so this is going to be minus past, and then it's going to take a verb phrase as a complement. So my cute puppy is the noun phrase that consists of a determiner my. It consists of an adjective phrase modifier, which will break down into an adjective, which is cute. And then the head of the noun phrase is puppy. So my cute puppy. Now we need to do is very happy. So is a verb, and very happy is an adjective phrase. So it's going to take the adjective phrase as a complement with the qualifier very and the adjective head, which is happy. So this might look a little bit weird to you to see an adjective phrase as a complement to a verb, but in the case of linking verbs, we said that is acting kind of like an equal sign, and the adjective is describing the noun phrase. So even though this might not look standard so far, it is acceptable, and those are the structures and categories of those phrases. So we can't really do anything else. Now, there's one more thing that can go under T, which are modals. So they're either labeled as T or mod in some cases. These are 9 words that convey things about knowledge, permissibility, and ability meanings. So our 9 modals, which are pretty helpful to memorize, are can, could, will, would, shall, should, may, might, and must. So these words do not have tense on them. Historically, they had different tense forms, like can and could were past and non-past. But nowadays, we don't consider these modals to have tense. So they don't have tense, and then the verb after it does not get any tense. So it's always he will leave, he will eat, he will be. In other words, it's not in a tensed form. So what we do is we put the modal underneath the T head. It's kind of taking the place of tense. So instead of adding plus past or minus past under T, we simply just put the modal and then we leave it at that. Now, there's one more thing that we can add for our predicates, which are auxiliaries. So the predicate doesn't necessarily have to be a VP. It can also be an auxiliary phrase. And auxiliaries are like these helping verbs. So we have several of them, which we'll discuss very shortly. But here are some examples. So auxiliaries usually designate things like, we should get rid of the modals here because we don't want to consider these auxiliary categories, although they are technically auxiliaries. They designate things like completion of an event, continuation of an event, and passive voice, as well as emphasis. So in the case of is leaving, leave is the verb. This is the action that you're taking, but is saying that it's ongoing. For did leave, did is adding emphasis to the fact that the leaving had happened. For had left, had is a perfect auxiliary that is telling us that the event has already completed, and then will, might, and should are modals, which are types of auxiliaries, but we do not put them underneath the auxiliary label. Now, we can have multiple of these auxiliaries back to back. There is a specific order to them, and we can see those soon. It's very restricted. So here's one example of an auxiliary. Winnie the Pooh is eating honey. So eating is the main verb. This is what's happening. Winnie the Pooh eats honey, but this is an ongoing action. So is an auxiliary that's going to form an auxiliary phrase. And because the verb phrase comes after it, in other words, is determining the form of the verb. If we have is here, we know it's going to be a progressive ing. The verb phrase will be its complement. So now when we think about TPs branching into predicates as complements, we can think of this as being either a VP or auxiliary phrases if auxiliaries exist. So there's 3 types. There's progressive, perfective, or perfect, and passive. We really shouldn't say perfective. There is a difference between perfect and perfective, but a lot of books will use them interchangeably. Perfect would be a more accurate description, but perfective, we'll go with that. So progressive auxiliaries are always be plus the verb with an ing ending. So is eating, are sleeping, am running, was smoking, things like that. The perfective auxiliary indicates completion, and this is always had plus the verb with an ed or en or even an irregular form. So some examples would be like had eaten, had jumped, or even an irregular form like had run, in which case it's just the same as the regular one. So had or have plus a verb gives us that perfective auxiliary. Now, with passives, this makes the subject demoted in a sentence and it focuses on the object. So this is when you have be plus the verb with the ed or en ending, or also these irregular forms. So in the case of was eaten, are slept, that doesn't make any sense, are investigated, and so many other examples that I can't think of off the top of my head because my brain is not searching for verbs at the moment. But if we have an auxiliary be, and we have that ed-en participle or irregular form after it, then we're looking at a passive. So the little trick to remember these is be plus ing gives us progressive, had plus our eden suffix is perfective. And when we take be and we combine both of these, so be and the participle, eden ending, then we get a passive voice. And there is a strict order that these have to occur in if they do occur. So my general example that I would use would be might have been being bought. Might have been being bought. Might have been being bought. Okay, so in this case, it's not supernatural for me to say something like this, but this is the strict order it has to occur in. First of all, the tense or modal has to occur first. Then we would have the perfective if it exists. Then we'd have the progressive if it exists. Then we'd have the passive if it exists. And then we'd have the voice. So we can have T plus up to 3 auxiliary phrases before we actually get to the verb. So let's draw some syntactic trees for these. First one, the marmalade was stolen. So we're going to do this one bottom up, and we'll do the second one top down. So the marmalade was stolen. We need to leave room for tense. So that's plus past. And then we have was and stolen. So the is a determiner, marmalade is a noun, past is tense, was stolen, so was stolen by someone. So this is an auxiliary, the passive, with a verb afterwards. If we work right to left, stolen is a verb phrase. The auxiliary forms into an auxiliary phrase and takes the verb phrase as its complement. Tense is going to build up into a tense phrase that takes the auxiliary phrase as the predicate complement, and the marmalade will form a noun phrase as a subject and connect up to the tense phrase. So that is the marmalade was stolen. We'll move that up to the top right. And now we'll do one which is top down. So I'm going to label things just a little bit in this sentence, just so I know what kind of categories I'll need. So must is a modal that'll be under T, and then be wanting. So this is an auxiliary plus the verb afterwards. So when I think about the complements I'm going to need to my tense phrase in this case, I'm going to need every caterpillar, which is a noun phrase. I'm going to need my T head, which is just must in this case. There's no tense. The modal is taking its place. And instead of a verb phrase as a complement, I'm going to take an auxiliary phrase. So that consists of the auxiliary be, and then wanting is a verb phrase with a verb head. Wanting, and you want something, you want that noun phrase complement direct object, which is a friend. So that's determiner plus noun for a friend. Now we just need to build our subject every caterpillar, which is a combination of determiner and noun, which is every plus the noun caterpillar. So that's how we can draw trees with auxiliaries in them. That's not too bad once you get a little bit of practice. Now, ambiguous sentences. So far, our structures have been pretty straightforward. It is obvious which types of words modify other words, but there are some examples where we have certain phrases that have an option between what they modify. So here's the comic. One morning, I shot an elephant in my pajamas, and there's some ambiguity within my pajamas. Is this describing the elephant, or is this describing how you're shooting it? Are you wearing pajamas? So this is prepositional phrase attachment ambiguity, and there's 2 ways that we can attach the prepositional phrase in this case. If the prepositional phrase is modifying the noun, then it attaches underneath the noun phrase. So the noun and prepositional phrase are sisters. If the prepositional phrase is describing how the action is being done, then it's going to be under the verb phrase as a modifier. So sisters to the verb in this case. So let's see these 2 in action. For I shot an elephant in my pajamas, if we want to say that I am the one wearing pajamas, then I'm saying that I shot an elephant. So this is the complement in this case. This is the direct object. And the prepositional phrase in my pajamas is acting as a modifier to the verb. So this is forming a connection with the verb because it's directly underneath the VP. Now, if I want to do I shot an elephant, and the elephant is the one wearing pajamas, Then this prepositional phrase is going to be under the NP because it's modifying the noun in this case. And when we think about the verb shot, it is now shooting this entire noun phrase, which is the direct object. So the elephant is wearing pajamas, and that is the thing that I am shooting. So let's try one syntactic tree that shows both of their different options. So Tim raced the dog with running shoes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a single structure that does not have with running shoes in it. So we're going to just start with Tim raced the dog. So that's going to be a tense phrase that breaks into a noun phrase, which is a noun. Tim, as far as tense goes, it is raced, so this will be plus past. This is going to take a verb phrase, complement with the verb raced. And then what are we racing? We're racing the noun phrase, the dog, which consists of a determiner and noun. So when we think about with running shoes, there's two places this can attach. One place this can attach, which I'll do in green, is beside the noun phrase. And this will tell us that the dog has running shoes on. So that would be with as a preposition, and then it takes the noun phrase, which consists of an adjective phrase and a noun, running shoes. I'm not filling up the whole noun adjective phrase because I will run out of space here. So that's one way we can attach it. The other way we can attach it, and I'll just use the power of technology to do this. We could, and I'll make it a different color, we could just attach it next to the verb phrase if it is going to modify the verb. So if we're saying that we did the racing with running shoes, in other words, Tim is the one with running shoes, then we would attach it next to the VP. So these are two possible structures that we have. We should just have one of these prepositional phrases in here. But if you're going with the red one, then you're looking at verb modification. If you're looking at the green one here, you're looking at noun modification. The last thing we want to do in syntax is talk about complement clauses for structure. So some verbs can take clauses as complements. You can think about them as little mini sentences. So I know if you are watching me. So if is what's called a complementizer, and what it does is it turns the following tense phrase into either a direct object, a subject, or a modifier. So you are watching me is its own little mini clause or sentence. If is introducing it. So what no does is no takes a complementizer phrase that has a complementizer head and a tense phrase as its complement. So we have a couple other types of complementizers. Here are a couple other words that fit that description. So Sean believes that his Tarkov run will be good. So his Tarkov run will be good is a little tense phrase, and that is a complementizer introducing it as a direct object. Carlos investigated whether people lost their hair from stress. Same thing, we can say people lost their hair from stress as its own standalone sentence, and whether is a complementizer that's introducing that TP as the direct object of investigated, basically. So in terms of our structure, we don't have to show an entire thing, but we can see how this works. So in the case of I know that something, everything looks fine up until the verb phrase. So I is a noun phrase subject, T is minus past, and the verb know builds into a verb phrase. The difference is now, instead of taking a noun phrase as a complement, we're taking a complementizer phrase, which takes a complementizer head and then introduces the tense phrase as its complement. I know there might be some confusing about complementizer or complement. Complementizer is a category and complement is essentially a function. So here's a full sentence. Sherry believed that a trip would be good. So let's just focus on a trip would be good, because this is its own tense phrase. Basically, we're going to build the tense phrase for a trip would be good, which is a noun phrase subject, modal T would, and then verb phrase be good. And that tense phrase is introduced by a complementizer C, which builds into a complementizer phrase, and then the verb takes the complementizer phrase as the direct object. So if you can build a tense phrase, then you can build a complementizer phrase and implement it. It looks scary because there's a lot more words, but again, we're just building piece by piece. We build a smaller tense phrase, and then we build our bigger tense phrase. The smaller tense phrase, and well, really the CP is what is known as an embedded clause. So it's a clause that is an argument for something in the sentence. So we can draw some tree structures for these. I will know whether you did it. We'll do one bottom up and the other two top down. So I will know whether you did it. Now the things with whether is that you can always put or not afterwards, but we will not include it. So I need to leave room for tense. So for you did it, well, did is past. It's just a main verb in this case. It's not an auxiliary. So let's label these categories. I is a pronoun that needs to build into a noun phrase. Will goes under T. Know is a verb. Whether is a complementizer introducing the tense phrase you did it. You is a pronoun that's going to have to build into a noun phrase. Past is tense. Did is the verb. And then it is another pronoun that needs to build into a noun phrase. So when we have multiple clauses, typically I like to build them from right to left when I do them bottom down. So did it is the predicate of our inner TP. So that's going to be a verb phrase that takes the noun phrase it as a complement. We have you did it. So this is going to be a tense phrase that takes you, the noun phrase as the subject specifier, and the verb phrase as its complement. Whether is introducing this TP. So this is going to be a complementizer phrase that introduces the TP. And know is taking the CP as its direct object. So this will be a verb phrase that takes a complementizer phrase to its right. Now we have I, the subject, will as tense, and know whether you did it as the predicate of the big TP. So we'll join these together under the higher TP. So all we did in this case was we built our smaller clause first, and then we built our bigger one second. So we will leave this one up. And now I will do some of them top down. So for I can believe that. Well, what's happening here? Maybe I'm trying to be a little bit tricky. So I is a noun phrase pronoun. Can is going to be a modal, so that goes under T. We have the verb phrase believe it, or sorry, believe that. I can believe that. So we have believe. Now in this case, that is not a complementizer. It's not introducing a TP after. This is just a regular pronoun. So this is a noun phrase that goes into the pronoun that. So a little tricky, but it's important to remember that just because you see the word that, it does not mean that it's a complementizer. It can just be a pronoun. Okay, for the last one, Steve knows that Mary knows that I know. Okay, this is gonna kind of suck to draw a tree for because we're gonna need a lot of space, but I can do this kind of small. So this will be a tense phrase with the noun phrase Steve as the subject. For tense, we have knows, so this will be minus past. So that's going to take a verb phrase predicate with the head knows. Now we're introducing that Mary knows that I know. So Mary knows that I know is a tense phrase on its own. So we're going to be selecting the complementizer phrase with the complement of that. And then we're going to start another TP inside, which would be Mary knows that I know. So let's do this in red. So now we have a new tense phrase with the noun phrase subject Mary. In terms of tense, it's also going to be minus past because we just have knows in this case. So what does she know? Well, that's the verb head in this case for knows. And then we're going to have to introduce that I know. So this is going to be another complementizer phrase. Maybe I can move this up a little bit. Yeah, I can move it up a little bit. So that's going to take the complement, which is that. And then we need to finish the last TP underneath, which we'll do in blue, which is I know. So this is another tense phrase, which takes a noun phrase, pronoun as a subject, I. In terms of tense, it is going to be minus past because it's know. And then the verb phrase is just going to be a verb that is know. So it looks scary, but again, we're just repeating the process where the Complementizer introduces a new tense phrase. Complementizer introduces a new tense phrase, and we're just building our tense phrases just like we have before. So we didn't show this because it's kind of odd to have complementizer phrases as subjects, just at least in spoken English, but you can have a CP subject. So that you love me excites me. So now instead of taking a noun phrase subject, we simply take a complementizer phrase as the specifier of the tense phrase. That is our new subject. So you love me is basically our subject here, but we need to introduce it with a complementizer to be grammatical. So that you love me excites me. So same thing as before. We have our smaller TP. We have the complementizer introducing that TP to form a complementizer phrase, and that is being embedded in a bigger tense phrase. So it's the same thing as if it were the complement of the verb. It's just in a different position. So the last thing we want to do in syntax is talk about complements and adjuncts. We've used the term modifiers for adjuncts, but adjuncts would be the more official term. And in some theories of syntax, which you would learn in a follow-up course, you need to be able to distinguish between these two. So in terms of complements and modifiers, complements are the things that are required by heads of other phrases. So in English, they always come after. So for instance, saw a dog. Verb, if this is transitive, requires a noun phrase direct object. Devoured it, this is a verb that requires a noun phrase direct object. Gave a hamster a wallet. These are both complements because gave is ditransitive, so it needs an indirect object and it needs a direct object. In the case of should go, if you have a modal auxiliary, in this case, you need to have something that follows it. So go would be the verb that is the complement to the modal. Now, adjuncts are a little bit different because adjuncts can usually or almost always be removed. So in the case of a happy day, we don't need to say happy. We can just say day. It's still grammatical. Right into the wall. We can still just say into the wall. Surprisingly stupid. We could just say stupid. Ate a cake quickly. We could just say ate a cake. So these are optional. They modify other words, and that makes them adjuncts. So how can we test to see whether we have an adjunct or a complement? Well, there's a nice strict rule in English that complements are closer to the head than adjuncts. So what this means is if we have a case where we have both a complement and an adjunct, the complement has to occur first. So we can say saw a dog last night. That's fine. In fact, I'm going to just write adjunct here. But we can't say saw last night a dog. So we can't put our adjunct before the complement. That is ungrammatical. If you have multiple adjuncts, that means that you can move them around. So there's no specific order that they need to be pronounced in. So if we have in the morning last week, that is fine, but we can also say last week in the morning. That is also okay. So if you want to test for complements and adjuncts, you can see if you can swap them. If you can swap both of them around, then you have two adjuncts. If you cannot swap them around, that means that one of them is going to be a complement and the other is an adjunct. So let's check to see whether these underlined phrases, so my Lamborghini, new, with it, my parents, truly, alone, and in the dark, are complements or adjuncts. So in the first one, Vin Diesel stole my Lamborghini. So stole is a verb, it needs a direct object. This is going to be a complement. How we can test it is to use a verb like quickly. Vin Diesel stole quickly my Lamborghini. It doesn't sound very good, but stole my Lamborghini quickly sounds better. So quickly is an adjunct. That's just a standard one for verbs. So we know that if we want to introduce it, it has to be after, which tells us that my Lamborghini would be a complement. Made a new show with it. So new is describing show. It's a modifying word. So this is going to be an adjunct. We can also say a new good show or a good new show. So it doesn't matter which order if we add in another adjunct. Now with it is also describing made in this case, if we're taking the typical interpretation. So because this is modifying another verb with information, this is going to be an adjunct, but we could say, I made a new show with it last night, or I made a new show last night with it. So if last night is an adjunct, then we can swap those two around. There's no issues. Okay, it was my parents who were truly afraid of getting lost alone in the dark. So was is going to be introducing a complement for my parents. We can't just say it was who were truly afraid of getting lost alone in the dark. We need that there. Uh, and if we want to add an adjunct here, it was knowingly my parents. It was my parents knowingly who were truly afraid. It's a little bit difficult with cleft constructions to really get at that adjunct difference because we don't typically put adjuncts after the was. Usually it's just the complement that we introduce. So in clefs, after was, you can think of it as like the direct object of was in this case. Okay, truly afraid. So this is just modifying afraid. How afraid was it? Well, truly afraid. So this is just going to be an adjunct. You could say who were really, truly afraid or truly, really afraid. Really would be another adjunct, and you can swap those around. Getting lost alone in the dark. So getting lost alone here in the dark, getting lost alone in the dark here. Okay, so if we do here, we can swap them with in the dark. Getting lost here alone, getting lost alone here. Okay, so the order that alone in the dark and something like here, which is another adjunct, they don't need to be in any specific order. So that tells us that these are all adjuncts. Otherwise, if there was a fixed order for one of them, then we'd know it's a complement.